We are in Daniel, the 4th chapter today. Thankfully, I don't have near as much hard time finding Daniel 4. Once I find my Bibles, I do actually finding my Bible. We spent a couple of weeks on Daniel, the 3rd chapter, and we've talked about this issue as we've stayed through Daniel, that one of maybe the strongest aspect of Daniel is the concept of the image. And we see this image throughout the entire book. The only competing concept with that image, or with these images, is the idea of how the people of God operate and conduct themselves and participate in a society and government in which they are a minority. Throughout the Old Testament, we see that that is not the case. That the Jewish history of the Old Testament up to the point of Daniel, Israel is center focus. But we know from history that that changes at this point in history for God's people and really is never remedied. And so Daniel is this book that the first century Christians, those Christians that we see in the New Testament, seem to draw on very heavily to figure out how is it that we live in this world. Because I think we can understand and we know instinctively, as well as through experience, that it's a whole lot easier to conduct ourselves in any such manner when everyone around us is doing somewhat that. And when the laws are in our favor, that makes it even easier. But that's not the case. That's not what God's kingdom is going to look like throughout the ages. And so the Israelites are learning, and they are seeing via example of Daniel, primarily Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how do we live when we're in a minority. Now, the primary example is, for them, and over again demonstrated throughout this book, is live by the Torah. Live by the Torah. Live by the Torah. For us, the application is live by God's will. Live by God's will. Live by God's will. It's the answer in all these circumstances. So, we see in Daniel chapter 2 the image of the dream that is still up here. And this is here because come chapter 7, we're going to see more. But this is the image of what the role of man looks like. And Daniel explains to Nebuchadnezzar, your role is going to end. It's glorious, but it's going to be followed by another kingdom. And then by another, and by another, and by another. And then the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God, is going to come streaming in like a meteor, hit this amazing image, blow it apart, and grow into a mountain itself. And then you're going to see what the role of God, the kingdom of God, looks like. We go then into chapter 3, where Nebuchadnezzar makes an image that seemingly represents his role, his kingdom, the Babylonian Empire. And everyone's to bow down in patriotic worship of this amazing empire in this image. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say no. Now they've been productive members of the government. Every step of the way they're working for the government. And yet they say, no, here's where we draw the line. Can't go there. And last week we talked about prayer, right? Because they'd say to Nebuchadnezzar, we're not going to be careful to answer you in this matter, because our God is able to deliver us. And when they said able to deliver us, I told you this last week and the week prior that we talked about it, that I don't think they meant our God is able to bring us safely through the flames. I think they meant our God's able to keep us out of this furnace. But they went into the flames. And yet, Nebuchadnezzar's observation of that is that the fire had no power over them. And that no other God could deliver in this manner. And I think the application for us today is not to, as Christians, to try and avoid hardships, to avoid difficulties, to avoid trials, but rather to live in such a way that those around us would say that the flames of that furnace have no power over the Christian, and that there's no other God that could deliver from such a situation. One concluding thought that I wanted to bring out is when Nebuchadnezzar looks into the fiery furnace, he sees not 3 men that he threw in there, but what does he see? A fourth anyhow, right? Yeah, a fourth. And that fourth is as what? Close. God, like the Son of God. Now, when we hear that term, Son of God, who do we think of? Jesus. It seems subtle, but this is important. And like I said, once we get into chapter 7, it's going to come back up in a different way. This is Nebuchadnezzar speaking. Is he looking in saying, it looks like Jesus in there with them? No. What is Nebuchadnezzar saying? That term, Son of God. What does it mean?
ESV, it says, like a son of the gods.
Okay. Now we're getting a little more literal to the context, so go ahead.
I'm just thinking that maybe he sees the power of the fourth man somehow, or somehow he sees the authority, like it would be from some kind of God.
From some kind of God. Now that's very different than what we think of the Son of God, isn't it?
He wouldn't understand that.
Yeah.
We see it in hindsight, but for them, they were pagan.
Yeah, absolutely. Son of God, what's that mean to Nebuchadnezzar? He's saying this fourth individual, this fourth being, is deity of some kind. Right? So think of the polytheistic pagan mind thought, and I think the Greek mythology presents this best to us. What are the sons of God? They're very superior, right? Nebuchadnezzar's looking in there and he's like, this is a human-like figure, but superior to human. It has deity involved with it. Now, Sharon said something. In retrospect, we see that is great. And there's a definite illustration here of Jesus, right? But I do think it's significant to note what Nebuchadnezzar's actually saying and what he's getting at here. Questions or comments on that, or any of our review? Now, if you recall back quite a ways to our overview. In fact, we even watched the majority of a Bible project video on the overview of Daniel. And in chapter 2 of this book, there's a significant transition in the literary makeup of the book. Do you remember what that transition was? What's the Old Testament written in? What language? Hebrew, mostly, right? Mostly. Now I'll give you a great big clue, right? What transition takes place starting in chapter 2? We can come back to it. It's even in our English translations, it's even a strong hint given it to us. Chapter 2, verse 4. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Hebrew. Wait. Mike made a huge mistake, didn't he? Aramaic. So from this point on, chapter 2 through chapter 7, Daniel is written not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic. Right? Now, additionally, if you recall back to that overview, the Aramaic aspect or part of this book has a neat structure where chapters 4 and 5 parallel each other. Chapters 3 and 6 parallel each other. And chapters 2 and 7 parallel each other. So the reason I mention that is because now in chapter 4, we're at a point where this parallel systems become very obvious. In fact, it's the most obvious point because the two chapters back to back are paralleling each other. So to this point in the book, we've talked about man's role, how it's not the image that God intended it to be in Genesis chapter 1, right? Man goes about things his own way, and so doing, he's not the glory of role that God would have him to be, but rather, again, I'm getting into chapter 7, it's more beast-like. And we're really going to start to augment that idea of man becoming like beast here in this 4th chapter. What's the difference between a godly role and ungodly role? What's the difference? I'm going to answer this in chapter 4, by the way. What's the difference between godly role and ungodly role? Make it a little simpler. What's the difference between a godly life and an ungodly life?
The ungodly life is full of sin.
Okay? Righteousness versus unrighteousness. But we've got, I don't disagree, I just want to go a little deeper. And in examining that, is there a righteous life that doesn't involve unrighteousness or sin? In other words, is there anyone here who's godly who doesn't commit unrighteousness? No. So that's not the sole difference, is it? It is a difference. I don't want to mitigate that, but I want to get one layer deeper. Where's the heart? Yeah, I am.
God, or is it with like self or evil or whatever, however you want to look at it?
So my heart, is it with God or with evil? Right? And that makes a difference. Now, if my heart's with God, with good, am I going to commit evil? Yeah. I do. So if I do, does that mean that my heart's not with God? That would mean no one's with God, right? So am I going to commit evil? Yes. Is my life going to look different, though, if my heart is set with God versus with evil, or with good versus evil? Absolutely. To me, this is the illustration that makes this clear. Do I ever treat Amanda inappropriately? Yeah, way too often, right? Do I love her, and do I strive to treat her well? Yes. I know it seems difficult to believe at times, but if I was trying to treat her poorly, it would be worse. You see, if my heart is with God, I'm still going to commit unrighteousness, but serving unrighteousness looks very different than serving God and falling short of that from time to time. From loving my wife and striving to treat her well, knowing I fail, versus hating my wife, being unfaithful to my wife, abusing my wife. Right? What's the difference between godly role and ungodly role? I think when we talk about the heart, we've come one layer deeper than action, but I think there's one more layer that we're knocking right on the door of. God's role doesn't change? Yeah, absolutely. So truth doesn't change, right? And we've talked about this from Old to New Testament. The how has changed over time, but the why has always been the same, right? So that truth, absolutely. Who's guiding my life? Absolutely. Which the word I'm looking for, and it's all over here, is submission. Humbling or submitting myself to God. Who's in charge? Me or God? Change sides. Me or God? Right? That's the difference. That's the difference between a righteous government and an unrighteous government. Now, coming to Daniel, the 4th chapter, we're going to see the most powerful man on the face of the earth think he's in charge. That's Daniel 4. In Daniel 5, it's this big plot twist. The most powerful man on the face of the earth thinks he's in charge. Not so much of a plot twist, right? It's exactly what you'd expect. But while these two chapters parallel themselves, there's a significant difference between the two chapters. Does anyone know what that is off the top of their head? Or off studying they've done in preparation for class today? What's the difference between Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 4, and Belshazzar, chapter 5? The handwriting's on the wall. The difference is whether either humbles himself and submits to God or not. Both make the same mistake. We look at these rulers and we're like, how can you not know God's in control? Stephanie brought it home. How many times have you thought you were in control of your life? You were going to live it the way you wanted it. Likely on a regular basis. You may be way better than me, that you don't struggle with that, but the rest of us, we struggle with that constantly, right? So imagine with all the power of this kingdom, how tempting that is. That's the theme. That's the purpose of chapter 4 and chapter 5. Is we examine these images, the role of mankind. Are we going to humble ourselves before God? Questions or comments? All right, then let's dig into it here. Chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. This is so extreme, and there is a little bit of historical evidence to support what Daniel writes here, but not very much. This is so extreme, what takes place in 1 through 3, that the vast majority of critics, vast majority of non-believers and even some believers say, this never happened. Never happened. Why would they say that? Well, for one, this is extreme. Verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar to all peoples. What do we have here? We have a decree. Right? Nebuchadnezzar is making a decree to his entire empire. Right? So, our president is standing before national TV reading off his teleprompter. Here's what he's going to say. Or attempt to say. Sorry. To all peoples and nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, please be multiplied to you. Please be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders of the Most High God that has done for me. Wow. Nebuchadnezzar standing on national TV and says, may peace be multiplied to you. I feel it necessary to make known to you. How many gods approximately did the Babylonians have? Do you remember? Double that. 4,000, yeah. 4,000 gods. And one of the other criticisms of this passage is the term he uses, the Most High God. God of gods. Right? They say, well, that's a Jewish term. Does it seem that unreasonable? And we're going to see Daniel involved in this scenario as we go throughout the chapter, that he would have no indication of Hebrew language, of Hebrew mindset of God and description of God, with Daniel as his number 2 or 3 in the kingdom, and his involvement with this. To me, it seems that Daniel would have helped him craft or draft this message. He says, seemed good to me, verse 2, to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs. This is the message. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. You ever hear a message, you ever hear someone make a statement and say, wow, what caused that? There's something more going on there. What was it? I've put myself as a Chaldean at this time, and Nebuchadnezzar sends out this decree that says, how great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom's an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. I'm thinking, what happened to this guy? Something's going on. This 4th chapter is about what went on. And this is part of the decree. Notice verse 4 continues. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house. All of a sudden, Nebuchadnezzar has the pen. I don't believe literally he has the pen. Daniel is writing this. But Nebuchadnezzar has the narrative. Nebuchadnezzar's telling this story. I was at ease in my house, and prosperity was in my palace. Now, at this time, it's at the end of Nebuchadnezzar's rule. The wars are over. The city is built. They're just finishing the final wall. We've talked throughout this study about how amazing Babylon was. And he's at his palace, stress-free. Then normally your phone rings, right? Not for Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't have that issue. We're going to see what his issue was. Verse 5, his phone rang. I saw a dream that made me afraid. The word afraid here is a drastic understatement. The Aramaic implies with it and carries with it this idea of complete and total terror. Nebuchadnezzar is shook to his very core. I was afraid. Continue in verse 5. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions of my head alarmed me. So what's he going to do about verse 6? So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, and that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. Then the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream. But they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last, Daniel came in before me. He was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the vision of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. I'm going to pause there in verse 9. Notice the difference in Nebuchadnezzar's description of God in his story versus his final statement that is at the beginning. The Most High God. Nebuchadnezzar at that point has a grasp of what's going on. As he's describing, he says, Daniel comes in, and he says, Daniel, I know you have the spirits of the holy gods. Now, he knows that Daniel's God is greater than the other gods, but that's a far cry from the statement he sends out in the original decree, isn't it? Now, question for you. He has this dream. Daniel's obviously already interpreted dreams when no one else could, and yet Daniel's the last to come in before him. Why? Why is Daniel? Why not go to Daniel first?
His gods, you know what I mean? His power, his resources, his he can make that happen. He doesn't need Daniel's God.
Yeah. Stephanie's getting at this idea. She says Nebuchadnezzar's mindset's very different than Daniel's. She's hinting at this idea that maybe Daniel might say something I'd rather not hear. Now, Daniel was the only one that could tell Nebuchadnezzar the dream and the interpretation of it here at the idol. But was it what Nebuchadnezzar wanted to hear? No. So we're not real hesitant. I don't think we're real excited why he respects Daniel to go back to him. That's one possibility. Another possibility is Daniel makes himself unavailable for a period of time to emphasize the situation. Daniel maybe was just busy, right? What is shown is that he comes in last. And there's a big contrast between him and the others. I think to Stephanie's point too, notice verse 8, at last Daniel came in before me. He was named Belteshazzar after the name of my God. Daniel, El, anytime we see El, is referring to God, right? Belteshazzar, Bel, He's referring to another god. We're emphasizing Nebuchadnezzar's, I think, giving us a pretty big clue that don't know that I'm real excited to hear what this guy has to say. I respect what he has to say. I believe what he has to say, but I'm not sure I want to go there. Questions or comments before we continue with verse 10? The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the ends of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. Nebuchadnezzar lays in bed and he has this dream of what? What's he dreaming about this time? Not a big statue or image. What's he dreaming about this time?
A tree.
Tree. A massive tree. I think we have here a healthy clue as to why Nebuchadnezzar was terrified. Now, when's the last time dreaming about a tree terrified you? Probably didn't. Although if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, I mean, trees could be terrifying, right? But why was it terrifying Nebuchadnezzar? We see this throughout Scripture. In fact, I think the clearest place, most familiar place for us to be aware of this is as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem for the last time, or the last week of his life. What does he do concerning a tree? Something very unique for Jesus.
Doesn't he curse the fig tree?
He curses the fig tree. What's that fig tree represent? He gives some huge clues.
Life and longevity.
Life and longevity. Generally it can. What does Jesus talk about right after he curses the fig tree? He says his disciples are completely amazed, and he says, if you had but a little bit of faith, you'd be able to do what? Move a mountain. Say this mountain, cast into the sea. What do mountains represent in Old Testament imagery? Nations. Remember, this meteorite is coming down, it's smashing into the feet of this image, blows apart the image, and what does it grow into? A mountain. Right? The imagery has significant meaning. Israel is about to crucify Jesus. He says to his disciples who are about to be completely dismayed by that, if you have but a little bit of faith, you could throw that nation into the sea. The sea, by the way, always represented heathen nations in the Old Testament. What's the connection between the tree and the mountain? They both represent Israel. The tree, in this particular instance, was more the religiosity of Israel. It was bearing no fruits. It wasn't ever going to produce fruits again. The point is, and we could go into a lot of Old Testament verses, that both in the Old Testament imagery and in the prophet, or in Middle East culture, trees referred to rulers or kingdoms, very oftentimes. It's something very common we see throughout Scripture and was part of their culture. When Nebuchadnezzar has this vivid image or vision of a tree, he says, uh-oh. Now, at first he would have been happy because this tree is beneficial for the whole world. We're getting at what the image is meant to be. What we as God's people bearing God's image are meant to be. What the role and governments of the world are meant to be. What the church is meant to be. The birds make their nest in it. The beasts take shade in it. The world eats from its fruit. You think at that point in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar's pretty happy? To the extent he understands it, yeah. Now here's why he has to call upon Daniel, though. The dream doesn't stop there. Continuing on in verse 13. I saw in the vision of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip it off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it, and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let the portion be with the beast in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. We're going to pause there for a second. That's why Nebuchadnezzar is terrified. He makes the connection to the tree to himself. Therefore, he makes a connection. He doesn't know what it means, but he makes a connection of devastation to himself. Now, we're going to end. I'm going to read 17 and 18. We're just going to end here. I want you to pay close attention, if you would, to verse 17, because it's the entire purpose of this chapter. Let the sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives to him whom he will, and sets over the lowest, lowest of men. Nebuchadnezzar, he's got a hold of himself, and we'll get into this next week. Lord willing, we'll pick up here next week. The purpose of the dream, the purpose of the fulfillment of the dream is for Nebuchadnezzar to know who's in control. God. Let's see if we can do that a little. I'm a little concerned. You don't want to eat grass for a month. Who's in control? God, yeah. Nebuchadnezzar has to go through a lot to figure this out. We don't want to go there. And who does he give the kingdom to? The lowliest. Right? Humblest. I can't remember the King James word there. That basest, is that right? I thought I heard you say it, Kevin. I'm sorry. I think basest is what I recall it being. Is Nebuchadnezzar great? No. God put you there. Right? Lots and lots to unpack here for next week, Lord willing. If not next week, the week following. Thank you much.